April 19, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final weeks, though the 12 German women pressed against the slats of the cattle truck didn't know that yet. They knew only that they were being transported somewhere into the American interior, far from the processing center in New York, where they had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Through gaps in the wooden panels, 24-year-old Greta Schneider watched the landscape transform from crowded eastern cities to endless prairie. The sky stretched wider than anything she had ever seen in Berlin, and the emptiness both terrified and mesmerized her. The truck finally stopped outside a compound of low buildings surrounded by barbed wire. But beyond the fence, Greta saw something that made no sense. Wooden structures that looked nothing like the factories where she had expected to work. Men on horseback moving in the distance. Cattle, hundreds of them, dotting hills that rolled toward mountains she couldn't even see the tops of. This wasn't an industrial labor camp. This was a ranch. Major William Patterson, the officer in charge of the facility, stood waiting as the women climbed down from the truck. His weathered face and dusty boots suggested he was more comfortable on horseback than behind a desk. He studied the 12 women with an expression that seemed more curious than hostile. "You ladies are being assigned to agricultural labor," he announced without preamble. "The ranches in this region are critically short-handed. Most of the young men are overseas. You'll be working on cattle operations, helping with whatever tasks the ranch owners need." The women exchanged confused glances. Greta had worked as a supervisor in a munitions factory. Beside her, Margaretha Vogt had been a radio operator. None of them knew anything about cattle or ranches or whatever agricultural labor meant in this vast, strange place. One of the younger women, Ilse, raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, we don't know how to do ranch work. We are city women." Major Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You'll learn. The ranchers are expecting workers, not experts. You'll be housed here at the camp but transported daily to assigned ranches. You'll work 6 days a week, with Sunday for rest. You'll be paid a small wage, per the Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner labor." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "The ranchers in this area are good people. They've agreed to take on German prisoners when they could have refused. I expect you to work hard and cause no trouble." As the major walked away to organize their processing, Greta turned to look again at the endless Montana landscape. In the distance, she could see riders moving cattle across a hillside. Even from here, there was something different about the way they sat their horses, the way they moved through space with an ease and confidence she couldn't quite name. She thought of the men she had known in Germany, rigid in their certainty and their need for control. These American cowboys seemed to exist in a different world entirely. She had no idea how different that world would prove to be. The next morning arrived with a cold wind that cut through Greta's thin prison uniform. She and 5 other women were loaded into the back of a pickup truck, driven by a silent guard who seemed more interested in his coffee than in watching them. The drive took nearly 40 minutes, winding through land so empty it made Greta's chest tighten with an unfamiliar feeling. Not quite fear, but something close to it. In Germany, you were never this far from other people, from buildings, from the organized structure of civilization. The Double R Ranch emerged gradually from the landscape, a main house, several barns, corrals filled with horses, and in every direction more land than Greta could comprehend. Thomas Redding stood waiting by the largest barn, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to measure everything with quiet assessment. He wore dusty jeans, scuffed boots, and a hat that had clearly seen years of sun and weather. Beside him stood 3 cowboys, younger men whose faces were shadowed by their hat brims. Redding stepped forward as the women climbed from the truck. "Morning, ladies," he said, his voice carrying a drawl that Greta found almost musical compared to the harsh German she was accustomed to. "I'm Thomas Redding. This is my ranch. You'll be helping us get through calving season and general ranch work." He gestured to the men beside him. "This here is Jack Morrison, my foreman. That's Billy Chen and Robert Walker. They'll show you what needs doing." Greta found herself staring at Jack Morrison despite trying not to. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of anything. But it wasn't his size that struck her. It was the way he stood. Relaxed but alert, confident without arrogance. When he tipped his hat to the women in greeting, the gesture seemed natural rather than mocking. Back home, men showed respect through rigid salutes and formal deference to rank. This casual acknowledgement felt somehow more genuine. "You ladies ever worked with cattle before?" Jack asked. His voice was deeper than Redding's, quieter. When all 6 women shook their heads, he smiled slightly. "That's all right. Neither had I once. You'll pick it up." He turned and began walking toward one of the barns, clearly expecting them to follow. As they walked, Greta noticed details that seemed insignificant, but somehow weren't. The way Jack held a gate open for them without making a show of it. How Billy Chen spoke to Margaretha with the same tone he used with his fellow cowboys, not the dismissive manner German soldiers used with women. The complete absence of shouting, of the rigid military bearing she had lived with for years. They reached the barn, where several horses stood in stalls. Jack ran his hand along one horse's neck with a gentleness that surprised Greta. "First thing you need to understand about ranch work," he said, "is that everything here depends on respect. Respect for the animals, for the land, for each other. You treat things right, they'll treat you right in return." It was such a simple philosophy, yet Greta realized she had never heard any German officer express anything like it. The first week passed in a blur of unfamiliar tasks and aching muscles. Greta and the other women were assigned various jobs around the ranch. Some helped in the main house kitchen under the supervision of Mrs. Redding, Thomas's wife. Others worked in the barns, learning to feed horses, muck stalls, and prepare equipment. The work was hard, far more physical than anything Greta had done in the factory, but something about it felt honest in a way she couldn't quite articulate. What struck her most wasn't the work itself, but the unspoken rules that governed everything at the R. She began to notice patterns in how the cowboys interacted with each other and with the German women. There was a code, invisible but unmistakable, that shaped every action and word. Jack Morrison embodied this code more than anyone. He never raised his voice, even when one of the newer horses spooked and nearly trampled Ilse. He simply stepped in, calmed the animal with firm hands and quiet words, then checked if Ilse was all right before moving on. No anger, no blame, just competent action. When Margaretha struggled to lift a heavy saddle, Billy Chen appeared beside her and lifted it without comment, as if helping were simply what any person would do. Greta watched Robert Walker one afternoon as he worked with a young colt that refused to be led. In Germany, she had seen men beat animals into submission, assert dominance through force. Robert stood patiently, letting the colt approach in its own time, rewarding each small step forward with gentle words and a steady hand. It took over an hour, but eventually the colt followed him willingly. "Patience," Robert explained when he noticed Greta watching, "always works better than force. Animals know when you respect them." She wondered if he knew he was describing more than just animal training. The code extended to how the men treated the women. Not once did any of the cowboys make crude comments or treat them as lesser. When Greta made a mistake measuring feed for the horses, Jack corrected her by showing her the right way, not by humiliating her. When Mrs. Redding needed help moving supplies from the truck, Thomas himself came to assist, despite being the ranch owner. There was no sense of tasks being beneath anyone's dignity. During the midday meal, served family style in the ranch kitchen, Greta observed how the men listened when someone spoke. Actually listened, not just waited for their turn to talk. They asked questions about Germany, about the women's lives before the war, with genuine curiosity rather than interrogation. Billy Chen shared stories about his grandfather's journey from China, drawing unexpected parallels with the women's displacement. That evening, walking back to the camp compound, Margaretha spoke what they were all thinking. "Did you notice how they never try to make you feel small, even when they're correcting you?" Greta nodded. She had noticed. She had noticed everything. and she was beginning to understand that what made these American cowboys different had nothing to do with their physical size and everything to do with how they chose to use their strength. By the third week, Greta had been reassigned to work primarily in the ranch kitchen alongside Mrs. Redding. The older woman, weathered by years of prairie sun but still strong, treated Greta with a matter-of-fact kindness that felt refreshing after months of being viewed as an enemy prisoner. She taught Greta how to make biscuits from scratch, how to prepare meals for ranch hands who worked from dawn until well past dark, and how to organize a kitchen that fed 12 people 3 times a day. The kitchen had large windows that overlooked the main corral, and Greta found herself watching Jack Morrison more than she should. He was the foreman, responsible for coordinating all the ranch work, yet he never stood apart, barking orders. Instead, he worked alongside his men, often taking the hardest jobs himself. She watched him break a difficult horse one morning, his movements fluid and purposeful, never violent. The horse fought at first, but Jack's patience and firm gentleness eventually won out. What fascinated Greta wasn't attraction, at least not in the simple sense. It was something deeper. Jack represented everything she had been taught men weren't supposed to be. He was strong but gentle, confident but humble, capable of authority without needing to dominate. She thought of her father back in Berlin, a factory manager who ruled his household with the same rigid control he used at work. She thought of the Nazi officers who had recruited her, men who equated masculinity with aggression and compliance with strength. One afternoon, Jack came into the kitchen to discuss the evening meal with Mrs. Redding. He removed his hat upon entering, another small gesture that struck Greta as significant. Mrs. Redding was dealing with a stubborn oven, and without being asked, Jack knelt down to examine the problem. Within minutes, he had identified the issue and fixed it, his large hands somehow delicate enough to handle the small mechanical parts. "You didn't have to do that," Mrs. Redding said warmly. "You've got enough work." Jack stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Took 2 minutes," he replied simply. "Besides, can't have you cooking on a faulty stove." He glanced at Greta, who had been silently kneading bread dough. "How are you settling in, Miss Schneider?" The question surprised her. In 3 weeks, this was the first time he had addressed her directly beyond work instructions. "I am learning," she answered in her careful English. "Everything here is very different." "Different good or different bad?" he asked, and there was genuine interest in his eyes. Greta paused, choosing her words carefully. "Different, in ways I did not know were possible." She wanted to say more, to explain that she had never known men could be like him, that strength didn't require cruelty, that authority could exist without domination. But her English failed her, and perhaps it was too much to say anyway. Jack nodded as if he understood what she couldn't articulate. "Well, if you need anything or have questions, just ask." He put his hat back on and returned to work, leaving Greta staring after him, her hands still buried in bread dough, her mind turning over a revelation she couldn't quite name yet. On a cold evening in early May, the mail arrived at the camp. For the first time since their capture, several of the German women received letters from home. Greta sat on her bunk, holding an envelope postmarked from Berlin, her hands trembling slightly. She had written to her mother months ago, never knowing if the letter would arrive or if anyone would respond. Now, holding proof that her family still existed, felt both comforting and terrifying. She opened the letter carefully. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than she remembered, the ink smudged in places as if tears had fallen on the paper. The words painted a picture of devastation. Berlin was rubble. Food was scarce. Her father had returned from the war, but he wasn't the man who had left. "He sits in silence most days," her mother wrote. "The factory is destroyed. He has no work, no purpose. He shouts at small things, then retreats into himself. Your brother helps where he can, but the men here, Greta, they are broken. Defeated, they shuffle through ruins like ghosts." Across the room, Margarethe was reading her own letter aloud to Ilse and another woman named Katrin. "My husband came home last month," Margarethe read, her voice catching. "He is not the Franz I married." He barely speaks. When he does, it is only to complain or to blame. He blames the government, the allies, the neighbors, me. He sits and drinks what little we have, and talks about the glory that was stolen from him. There is no gentleness left in him. The women sat in heavy silence, each processing their own letters. Katrin had learned her fiancé was killed in the final days of fighting. Ilse's father had lost both legs. Another woman, Sophie, discovered her entire neighborhood had been destroyed in bombing raids. The letters from Germany all told variations of the same story: devastation, defeat, and men who had returned physically but seemed to have left some essential part of themselves on the battlefield. Greta thought about the men she worked with every day. She thought about Jack Morrison's quiet confidence, Thomas Redding's steady leadership, Billy Chen's easy laughter even after long days of hard work. These American men hadn't experienced defeat, true, but it was more than that. They carried themselves with a fundamental belief in their own agency, their ability to shape their circumstances rather than be crushed by them. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta couldn't stop comparing. Her father had always demanded respect through fear and rigid control. Even before the war, he had governed their household like a military operation. Franz, Margareta's husband, had been similar from what she had shared. Strict, unyielding, requiring absolute deference from his wife. These seemed to be the only models of masculinity Germany offered: dominate or be dominated, control or be controlled. But here in Montana, she had seen something entirely different. Men who were strong without being cruel, who led without demanding submission, who treated women as capable partners rather than subordinates to be managed. The contrast was so stark, it made her chest ache with a longing she didn't fully understand. Not longing for any particular man, but for the world that could produce such men, a world where strength meant something completely different than what she had always known. The Montana spring turned warmer, and with it came an expansion of the women's duties. Thomas Redding made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own ranch hands. He announced that the German women would begin learning actual ranch work, not just kitchen and barn chores. Jack Morrison looked skeptical when Redding first proposed it, but the ranch owner was firm. "They're capable people," he said simply. "Might as well teach them something useful." And so, Greta found herself on horseback for the first time in her life. The horse, a gentle mare named Rosie, seemed far too large and far too alive beneath her. Jack stood holding the reins, his other hand steadying Greta's boot in the stirrup. "She's calm as Sunday morning," he assured her. "Just sit easy and let her know you trust her." Greta wanted to say she didn't trust the horse at all, but she swallowed her fear and settled into the saddle. The first ride was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Jack led Rosie in slow circles around the corral while Greta gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles. But gradually, something shifted. She began to feel the rhythm of the horse's movement, to understand the animal beneath her as a living being rather than a threat. By the end of the hour, she was walking Rosie independently, and the smile on her face felt unfamiliar, as if her facial muscles had forgotten how to form such an expression. Over the following weeks, the women learned skills that would have been unimaginable back in Germany. They learned to rope fence posts, though their throws were clumsy compared to the Cowboys' practiced ease. They learned to identify sick cattle, to read weather signs in the clouds, to navigate by landmarks across land that still seemed impossibly vast. Margarita discovered she had a natural talent with horses. Ilse learned to drive the ranch truck, her concentration fierce as she navigated rutted dirt roads. What struck Greta most wasn't the skills themselves, but the way they were taught. Back home, instruction had always come with impatience, with criticism when she failed to grasp something immediately. Here, Jack would demonstrate a task, let her try, and when she inevitably made mistakes, he would simply show her again without frustration. "That's it," he would say when she got something right. "You're learning." One afternoon, Greta sat on horseback overlooking a valley that stretched toward mountains still capped with snow. Billy Chen had ridden out with her to check on cattle in the far pasture. They paused on a ridge, and Billy pulled out a canteen, offering it to her first before drinking himself. "You getting used to it out here?" he asked. Greta nodded, though used to it felt inadequate. She was being transformed by it. The openness of the land seemed to be creating openness inside her, space for thoughts and possibilities she had never allowed herself before. In Germany, everything was defined, bordered, controlled. Here, the horizon seemed to suggest that life could be bigger than she had imagined, that she could be bigger than she had imagined. Late May brought the spring roundup, when scattered cattle needed to be gathered from distant pastures and brought closer to the ranch for branding and medical care. Thomas Redding announced that the German women would participate, and Greta saw several of the cowboys exchange doubtful glances. Roundup was hard, dangerous work that required skill and endurance. But Redding's word was final, and so, on a cool morning, Greta found herself mounted on Rosie, riding out with a crew of 8 cowboys and 4 other German women. The work was unlike anything Greta had experienced. They rode for hours, spreading out across rolling hills to locate cattle hiding in draws and ravines. Jack Morrison led the operation with quiet efficiency, directing riders with hand signals and occasional short calls. Greta watched how he read the land, anticipating where cattle might be, positioning riders to move the herd without stampeding them. It was like watching someone conduct a symphony, each element coordinated but not controlled. Her first real test came mid-morning. A young steer broke from the group, racing toward rough terrain where it could injure itself. Without thinking, Greta urged Rosie forward, following her weeks of training. She could hear Billy Chen shouting encouragement behind her, but her focus narrowed to the fleeing animal and the ground racing beneath her horse's hooves. Somehow, miraculously, she managed to get ahead of the steer and turn it back toward the main herd. When she returned, breathing hard, Jack rode up beside her. "Good work," he said simply, but the approval in his eyes meant more than any elaborate praise could have. "You've got good instincts." The real crisis came just after noon. Robert Walker's horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole, throwing him hard. Before anyone could react, a bull that had been separated from the herd charged toward the fallen cowboy. Robert was struggling to rise, clearly dazed from the fall. The bull was closing fast, head lowered, over 1,000 pounds of muscle and fury. Greta didn't remember making the decision. She just moved. Rosie responded to her urgency, racing toward the bull at an angle. Greta screamed, waving her hat, doing anything to draw the animal's attention away from Robert. The bull swung its massive head toward her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it would charge her instead. But Jack was already there, his horse cutting between Greta and the bull, his rope flying to catch the animal's horns. Billy Chen arrived from the other side, and together they controlled the bull while 2 other cowboys pulled Robert to safety. Later, as they drove the herd toward the ranch, Robert rode up beside Greta. His face was bruised, but he was grinning. "You might have saved my life back there, Miss Schneider. I won't forget it." "Neither will I," Jack added, riding past. That took real courage. That evening, something had fundamentally changed. The cowboys no longer looked at the German women as prisoners doing assigned labor. They looked at them as fellow ranch hands who had proven themselves when it mattered most. The roundup lasted 3 days, and the crew camped in the far pastures rather than riding back to the ranch each night. This was new territory for the German women, sleeping under stars so bright they seemed artificial, eating meals cooked over an open fire, and spending evenings in the company of men without the formal separation that had always existed back at the camp compound. After the sun set on the first night, the cowboys gathered around the fire while Mrs. Redding's daughter, who had come along as camp cook, served coffee strong enough to strip paint. The cattle were settled for the night, watched by 2 riders on rotation, and the rest of the crew relaxed into the easy camaraderie that came after hard work completed together. Billy Chen started it, telling a story about his grandfather's arrival in California in the 1880s. "Came over with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build something," Billy said, his face illuminated by firelight. "People told him he didn't belong, that he should go back where he came from. But he just kept working. kept proving himself, until even the people who hated him had to respect what he'd built. Robert Walker shared his own family story. His grandfather had been a slave, freed after the Civil War with nothing. Started as a ranch hand in Texas, learned everything he could, eventually bought his own small spread. Taught my father that being a man wasn't about what color you were or where you started. It was about what you did with your own two hands and how you treated people along the way. Jack Morrison, who rarely spoke about himself, surprised everyone by opening up. "My father died when I was 12, he said quietly. Left my mother with 4 kids and a failing farm in Oklahoma. I watched her work herself near to death, trying to keep us fed. When I was old enough, I left to find ranch work, sent every penny home." He stared into the fire. "Taught me that strength isn't about dominating others, it's about taking care of the people who depend on you." Thomas Redding added his own perspective. "This country was built by people who came from somewhere else," he said, looking directly at the German women. "People who wanted a chance to prove what they could do without being told their place was already decided. That's what makes America different. You get to choose who you become." Greta listened to these stories with a growing realization. These men weren't strong because they had inherited privilege or demanded submission. They were strong because they had overcome hardship, because they had built themselves through work and determination. Their confidence came from competence, not from enforced hierarchy. Their respect for others came from having earned respect themselves through actions rather than demanding it through authority. Later, lying in her bedroll under impossible stars, Greta thought about the men described in her mother's letters. Broken men who had lost wars and lost themselves in the process. She thought about her father, who had always seemed powerful but now revealed as fragile when his carefully constructed world of control collapsed. These American cowboys had a different kind of strength entirely, the kind that didn't break. In mid-June, the town of Clearwater held its annual summer dance at the community hall. Thomas Redding mentioned it casually one evening, then surprised everyone by saying he thought the German women should attend. The reaction from his ranch hands was mixed. Some nodded approval. Others looked uncertain. The town's reaction would be unpredictable. Major Patterson at the camp was hesitant, but ultimately agreed, with conditions. The women would be accompanied by guards, would wear identification marking them as prisoners, and would leave at the first sign of trouble. Greta wasn't sure she wanted to go. The thought of facing a crowd of Americans, many of whom likely had sons or husbands fighting overseas, filled her with dread. But Margaretha convinced her. "When else will we have a chance to see how normal Americans live?" she asked. "Besides, we can't hide forever." The community hall was a simple wooden building decorated with paper streamers and lanterns. Music drifted from inside, a live band playing songs Greta didn't recognize but found herself tapping her foot to. As the German women entered, conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward them. Greta felt the weight of those stares, the mixture of curiosity and suspicion and outright hostility on some faces. Then Jack Morrison stepped forward, removed his hat, and asked Margaretha if she would like to dance. The gesture broke the tension like a stone through glass. If Jack Morrison, the most respected foreman in the county, was willing to dance with a German prisoner, then others could consider doing the same. Billy Chen asked Ilse. Robert Walker approached Katrin. Within minutes, the German women were swept into the dancing, and the initial hostility softened into wary acceptance. Greta found herself dancing with a succession of cowboys and local ranchers, men who treated her with surprising courtesy. They weren't effusive or overly friendly, but they were polite, asking her simple questions about where she was from and how she was adjusting to ranch work. No one mentioned the war directly. It was as if they had collectively decided to set that aside for one evening. The real revelation came during a break in the dancing. Greta stood near the refreshment table when an older woman approached her. The woman's eyes were hard, and Greta braced for confrontation. "My son is fighting in the Pacific," the woman said flatly. "He's 19 years old, and I haven't heard from him in 2 months." Greta didn't know what to say. "I am sorry," she managed. The woman studied her for a long moment. Thomas Redding told me you saved Robert Walker from a bull during roundup, that you didn't hesitate. Greta nodded, uncertain where this was going. The woman's expression softened slightly, though pain still lingered in her eyes. I still don't know how I feel about German prisoners being here, but I suppose people can surprise you. She paused, then extended her hand. I'm Martha Walker, Robert's mother. Thank you for what you did for my boy. Greta shook her hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. That simple gesture of recognition, of acknowledgement that she could be more than just an enemy, meant more than any elaborate welcome could have. The dance had opened something among the women, loosened tongues that had been carefully guarded for months. A week later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon at the camp, Margaretha gathered several of the women in the common room and began to speak about her life before the war. At 38, she was the oldest among them, and her marriage to Franz had lasted 15 years before she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. I thought I loved him, Margaretha said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Or maybe I just didn't know there was any other way to be married. She looked up at the other women. Franz decided everything. What I wore, when I could visit my sister, how I spent every hour of every day. He never asked my opinion. If I offered one without being asked, he would remind me that a wife's job was to support her husband's decisions, not question them. Greta listened, recognizing echoes of her own father's marriage. Her mother had moved through their home like a shadow, always anticipating her husband's needs, never expressing desires of her own. When Franz came home from work, Margaretha continued, I had to have his dinner ready at exactly 6 o'clock. Not 5:58, not 6:02. Exactly 6. If something was wrong with the meal, or if I had failed in some household task, he would lecture me about my inadequacy, not yelling, you understand. That would have been undignified. Just cold, precise explanations of my failures as a wife. But you joined the Auxiliary Corps, Ilse said. How did he allow that? Margaretha smiled bitterly. He didn't. I joined after he was deployed. I told myself I was serving the fatherland, doing my duty. But honestly, I was grateful for the distance. Grateful to make decisions for myself, even small ones. Grateful to be valued for my work, rather than for how well I maintained a household. The room was silent, except for the wind outside. Then Margaretha said what they were all thinking. Working here, with these American men, I keep waiting for them to show their true nature. To reveal that their courtesy is just a mask for the same need to control and dominate, but it never comes. She shook her head in wonder. Thomas Redding asks Mrs. Redding's opinion about ranch decisions. Actually asks, and actually listens. Jack Morrison thanks the men who work under him. Billy Chen apologized to me last week when he accidentally interrupted me. Apologized as if my words mattered as much as his. Her voice grew thick with emotion. I spent 15 years believing that a man's authority over his wife was natural, ordained, the way things had to be. And now, I see men who are strong, capable, respected leaders, and they don't need to diminish anyone to feel powerful. They don't need to control everyone around them to feel secure in themselves. Greta reached over and squeezed Margaretha's hand. We were taught it was strength, she said softly, but maybe it was always weakness. Maybe truly strong men don't need to make others small. August brought news that the war in the Pacific had ended. Japan had surrendered, and the world was finally at peace. For the German women at the camp, this meant their status would soon change. Repatriation procedures would begin in earnest. Within weeks, they would be processed and sent back to Germany, back to the rubble of Berlin, to the broken men described in their letters, to a defeated country trying to rebuild from devastation. Greta had been dreading this moment since spring. She lay awake at night thinking about returning to her father's house, to the rigid control that had defined her entire life before the war. She thought about the letters from her mother, describing a man who had become even more bitter and controlling in defeat. The thought of going back felt like stepping into a prison far more confining than the camp had ever been. Then Thomas Redding called a meeting with all the women who worked at the RR. He stood in the ranch kitchen, hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Ladies," he began, "I've been thinking about what happens when you're sent home. I know some of you are eager to return to your families, but I also know that some of you might be facing difficult situations back in Germany." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Mrs. Redding and I have been discussing this, and we've talked to some of the other ranchers in the area. We'd like to offer you a choice. If any of you want to stay on here as paid workers, we'll sponsor your immigration applications. It won't be easy. There will be paperwork, interviews, probably suspicion from some quarters. But if you're willing to work hard and build a life here, we'll help you do it." The silence that followed was deafening. Greta felt her heart hammering in her chest. Stay? The possibility had lived in her daydreams but never seemed real. Now here it was, offered plainly by a man who had no obligation to help enemy prisoners beyond what the Geneva Convention required. Jack Morrison spoke up from where he leaned against the doorframe. "Speaking for myself and the other hands, we'd be glad to have you stay. You've proven yourselves as good workers and good people. That's what matters out here." Mrs. Redding added her voice. "This won't be charity. You'll earn your keep same as anyone. But you'll also be free to make your own choices. Build your own lives. That's what America offers. A chance to become whoever you want to be." That night the women gathered in their barracks and talked until dawn. Some were certain they needed to return home, to face whatever awaited them in Germany with courage. Others felt pulled toward this unexpected opportunity, but feared it was somehow wrong to abandon their homeland, even a homeland that had revealed itself to be built on lies and atrocities. Greta sat quietly, listening to the debate rage around her. But in her heart, she already knew her answer. She had found something in Montana that she had never known existed. Not just freedom from control, but freedom to discover who she could become. The decision deadline loomed, and the women found themselves unable to avoid the central question any longer. What exactly had they found here that made the choice so agonizing? One evening, Margarita suggested they try to put it into words, to articulate what had been shifting inside them over the past months. "It's the way they stand," Ilse said first. She was the youngest at 19, and her observations often cut to the heart of things. Back home, men stood like they were always ready for confrontation, always proving something. Here, they stand like they're comfortable in their own skin. They don't need to puff themselves up. Greta nodded, thinking of her father's rigid posture, the way every movement seemed designed to assert authority. Jack Morrison moved with easy confidence, never rigid, never performing masculinity for an audience. He simply was, without apology or exaggeration. "They listen," Katrin added. "Actually listen when you speak, not just waiting for their turn to tell you why you're wrong." "Franz never let me finish a sentence," Margarita said quietly. "He would interrupt within seconds, explaining what I really meant or correcting my thinking. Thomas Redding asked me last week what I thought about changing the feeding schedule for the horses, asked my opinion like it had value, and when they're wrong about something, they admit it," another woman named Sophie said. "Billy Chen made a mistake calculating feed last week and just said, 'I got that wrong,' like it was nothing. No shame, no anger, just fixing the problem and moving on." The conversation continued, each woman adding observations that built a collective picture. American cowboys who didn't need to dominate to feel powerful, who could be strong without being cruel, who treated women as capable partners rather than possessions to be managed, who found their sense of worth in their work and character rather than in controlling others. But Greta finally voiced what she thought was the deepest difference. "They believe they can shape their own future," she said, "not just accept what's handed to them or what authority tells them must be. Every story they tell is about someone who decided to become something and then did it through their own effort." Her voice grew stronger. "Back home, you are what your father was, what your station determines, what the state requires. Here, you can choose. That's why the war broke our men," Margarita said suddenly, her eyes widening with realization. It wasn't just losing. It was having everything they built their identity on revealed as false. They thought their strength came from the system, from the hierarchy, from dominance. When that system collapsed, they had nothing left. These American men, their strength comes from inside themselves, from their own capability and character. No one can take that away. The room fell silent as this understanding settled over them. They weren't just choosing between two countries. They were choosing between two completely different definitions of what strength meant, what freedom meant, what being human meant. And for 7 of the 12 women, including Greta and Margaretha, the choice had become clear. September 15th, 1945. The day had arrived when the women needed to formally declare their intentions to Major Patterson. Those choosing repatriation would begin processing immediately. Those choosing to stay would start the complicated journey toward immigration status, a path with no guarantees and certain to be filled with bureaucratic obstacles and public scrutiny. The women gathered in the camp's administrative building. Major Patterson sat behind his desk, paperwork spread before him, his expression neutral. He had been a fair administrator, neither cruel nor particularly warm, and Greta suspected he found this situation as unprecedented as they did. One by one, the women stated their decisions. 5 chose repatriation. They spoke of duty to help rebuild Germany, of family members who needed them, of wanting to face their homeland's future rather than escape it. Greta respected their choice even as her own heart pulled in a different direction. Then it was her turn. She stood, smoothing her worn dress, and met Patterson's eyes. "I wish to stay in America, sir. I wish to apply for immigration status and remain here if it is permitted." Patterson made a note on his paperwork. "You understand this will be difficult? There will be investigations, interviews, probably hostility from some quarters. The process could take years, and there's no guarantee of approval." "I understand," Greta said firmly. "But I have learned here what I did not know was possible. I have learned that I am capable of more than I was allowed to be. I do not want to return to being less than I can become." Margaretha spoke next, her voice steady despite tears on her cheeks. "I spent 15 years in a marriage that made me smaller every day. Here, I have been allowed to grow. I choose to stay." One by one, 7 women total made the same choice. Greta, Margaretha, Ilse, Katrin, Sophie, and 2 others named Helga and Anna. Not quite half of their original group, but enough to matter. Enough to represent something significant. The 5 choosing repatriation showed no anger toward those staying. Instead, one of them, a woman named Elizabeth, spoke for the group. "We understand why you're staying," she said. "Part of me wishes I had your courage. But Germany is still our home, broken as it is. Someone needs to help rebuild it. Maybe we can take back what we learned here, show German men a different way of being strong." That afternoon, Thomas Redding arrived at the camp with Jack Morrison and several other ranchers from the area. They had come prepared with sponsorship papers, job offers, and housing arrangements. The efficiency and thoroughness of their preparation told Greta they had been planning this for weeks, perhaps months, believing in the women's worth before the women fully believed in themselves. Jack approached Greta directly. "The Henderson family in town has a spare room," he said. "Mrs. Henderson is a teacher and said she'd be glad for the company. Thomas will keep you on at the ranch for as long as you want the work." He paused, then added, "You've earned this chance, Miss Schneider. Don't let anyone tell you different." The news of 7 German POW women choosing to remain in America rather than accept repatriation spread quickly through Montana and beyond. Reaction was swift and divided. The Clearwater Gazette ran a front-page story with the headline, "Enemy Prisoners Refuse Freedom, Local Ranchers Offer Support." Within days, letters to the editor flooded in from across the state and neighboring regions. Some were supportive, praising the women's work ethic and the American tradition of offering second chances. A local pastor wrote eloquently about redemption and the Christian duty to forgive. Several ranchers who had worked with the women wrote testimonials about their character and capability. Martha Walker, Robert's mother, submitted a letter describing how Greta had saved her son's life during the roundup, but others were furious. How dare these Nazi prisoners refuse to face justice in their own country? One letter demanded. My son died at Normandy, and we're supposed to welcome his enemies with open arms? Another accused the women of cowardice, of taking the easy path rather than facing the consequences of their nation's actions. The harshest criticism came from some returning American soldiers who stopped in Clearwater on their way home. One veteran confronted Greta outside the general store where she had gone to buy supplies. You think you can just walk away from what your country did? He said, his voice tight with anger. You think working on a ranch for a few months makes up for the camps, for the people your army killed? Greta met his eyes, refusing to look away despite her fear. I cannot change what Germany did, she said quietly. I cannot undo the evil that was done in my country's name. But I can choose what I do with the rest of my life. I can choose to be better than I was. The soldier stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Greta stood trembling, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if the judgment would ever end. But support came from unexpected places. Billy Chen, who understood what it meant to face prejudice, made a point of walking with the German women when they came to town. His presence a silent statement that they were under the protection of respected community members. Mrs. Henderson invited Greta to church and introduced her to the congregation without apology, daring anyone to object. The debate reached its peak when a group of concerned citizens requested a town meeting to discuss whether the German women should be allowed to settle in the area. The community hall filled beyond capacity, voices raised on both sides. Thomas Redding stood and spoke about the women's work, their character, and the American principle that people should be judged by their actions rather than their origins. Then Jack Morrison did something that surprised everyone. He asked Greta to speak for herself, to tell her own story to the assembled community. She stood before a crowd of strangers, many hostile, and found her voice. What emerged was not a plea for sympathy, but an honest reckoning with both her past and her hopes for the future. The town meeting didn't resolve all opposition, but it shifted something fundamental. The majority of Clearwater's citizens voted to support the women's immigration applications, and the process moved forward with surprising speed. By November of 1945, the 7 German women had been officially reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons with temporary work permits. Full citizenship would take years, but they had taken the first step. Greta moved into the Henderson home and found in Mrs. Henderson a mentor she had never known she needed. The older woman encouraged her to continue her education, loaning her books and discussing ideas with the same respect she would show any intellectual equal. Greta's English improved rapidly, and with it came opportunities. She began working as a translator for the county, helping process the paperwork of other displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Her work at the R Ranch continued on weekends and during busy seasons. She discovered she genuinely loved the physical labor, the connection to land and animals, the satisfaction of a hard day's work completed. More than that, she loved the community that had formed among the ranch hands, the easy camaraderie that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. Marguerite flourished in ways that surprised even herself. She took a position, managing the books for 3 local ranches, her organizational skills finally recognized and valued. She filed for divorce from Franz, a decision that would have been unthinkable in Germany but felt necessary for her new life. I spent 15 years being told I was incapable, she told Greta one evening. Now I'm running the financial operations for 3 successful businesses. Turns out I was always capable. I just needed someone to give me the chance to prove it. Ilse, the youngest, enrolled in the local high school to complete her education. She faced taunts from some students but found allies in others, and her determination to learn impressed even her harshest critics. Katrin took a job at the local hospital, training as a nurse. Sophie opened a small seamstress shop, her skill with a needle creating demand that overcame initial prejudice. The most significant development came from an unexpected direction. Jack Morrison began courting Greta with a patience and respect that felt revolutionary. He asked if he could take her to dinner, asked if he could hold her hand, asked permission for every step rather than assuming entitlement. Their courtship was the talk of Clearwater, some approving, others scandalized by the foreman dating a former enemy prisoner. On a cold December evening, Jack asked Greta to marry him, not with grand declarations or pressure, but with a simple question that acknowledged her autonomy. "I'd like to spend my life with you, if you'd like to spend yours with me. No expectation of subservience, no assumption of control. Just two people choosing to build something together." Greta said yes, not because she needed rescuing or security, but because she had found in Jack a partnership she hadn't known was possible, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than domination, on equality rather than hierarchy. 25 years later, in 1970, Greta Morrison stood on the porch of the ranch she and Jack had built together. The Double R had been divided when Thomas Redding retired, and Jack had purchased a portion to establish his own operation. Greta had been a full partner in every decision, from which cattle to raise to how to manage their finances. Their 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, were being raised to believe that strength came from character rather than domination, from capability rather than control. A journalist from a national magazine had come to interview her about the unusual story of German POW women who had chosen to stay in America. The journalist was young, curious about a piece of history that seemed almost unbelievable in its outcome. "What made you stay?" she asked, her notepad ready. "What made these cowboys so different from the men you knew in Germany?" Greta was silent for a moment, considering how to articulate something she had spent decades understanding. "It wasn't their physical size," she finally said, "though that's what I noticed first. American cowboys seemed larger than life. But the real difference was in how they defined strength itself." She gestured toward the corral where Jack was working with their son, teaching him how to gentle a young horse. "In Germany, I was taught that strong men control others, that masculinity means dominating those weaker than yourself, that a man's worth comes from his position in a hierarchy. But here, I discovered men who were strong because they controlled themselves, who were confident because they were competent, who led through respect rather than fear." The journalist scribbled notes. Fascinated. "And that's why you married Jack Morrison?" Greta smiled. "I married Jack because he asked me to be his partner, not his subordinate, because he valued my opinions, trusted my judgment, and never once tried to make himself feel bigger by making me feel smaller." She paused, remembering that first cold morning when she arrived at the ranch, terrified and uncertain. "The cowboys I met here showed me that true strength doesn't require anyone else to be weak, that real confidence doesn't need to prove itself through control." When the journalist asked what advice she would give to the young women of 1970, Greta thought carefully. "Know your worth," she said. "Don't accept being diminished by anyone, no matter how much they claim it's for your own good or tradition or natural order. I spent 24 years believing I needed to be small so men could feel large. Then I came to Montana and discovered I could be fully myself, and the truly strong men weren't threatened by that. They were glad of it." As the journalist left, Greta watched Jack walking toward the house, his stride still confident but no longer seeming foreign to her. He was just her husband, her partner, her friend. Not larger than any man back home in some mythical sense. Just larger in the ways that truly mattered. In character, in integrity, in the freedom he offered her to become everything she was capable of being. That, she had learned, was the measure of a man's true size.